In the fading light of a West Texas evening, time moves differently. 9 years can feel like yesterday when a promise goes unfulfilled. November 17, 2013, the night 18-year-old Zoe Gabrielle Campos texted, "Be home soon." Her gray car would be spotted the next night, driven by a hooded stranger who slipped away at an intersection, leaving only questions that hardened into silence. For years, the case lived in that terrible space between hope and grief. Vigils flickered, searches ended, files gathered dust. The community learned to carry absence like a weight they couldn't name. Until the ground itself began to speak. Until a construction crew uncovered what time thought it had buried. Until a handwritten confession arrived at a newsroom, penned by the very hands that had stolen a life and hidden it away. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Some promises echo across time itself. What happened to Zoe that November night? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The porch light cast a warm glow across the family duplex as Zoe Gabrielle Campos slipped her phone into her back pocket. The November air carried that crisp bite unique to West Texas evenings, where the horizon stretches endless under a sky bigger than anywhere else on Earth. "I'll be back soon," she called to her mother from the doorway, her voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who had made this promise 1,000 times before. The streetlights hummed their electric lullaby as she walked toward her gray car, keys jingling softly in the stillness. At 18, Zoe moved through the world with the kind of open-hearted trust that anchored her family's daily rhythms. She was the one who remembered to text updates, who checked in, who made sure everyone knew where she was going. Tonight would be no different, just a quick errand. Maybe meeting a friend, nothing that required details or worry. The car door closed with a soft thud, the engine turned over, taillights disappeared around the corner, carrying with them the last ordinary moment the Campos family would ever know. By 9:30 p.m., the house settled into its familiar evening quiet. The television murmured in the living room. Dishes clinked in the kitchen sink. Time moved forward the way it always had, unmarked by the violence that was already unfolding somewhere in the city's maze of residential streets. The porch light stayed on. It always did when family was still out. Dawn crept across Lubbock with the pale persistence of a city waking up to Tuesday. In the Campos kitchen, coffee brewed in the automatic maker, steam rising from the pot like incense. But something felt wrong in the morning stillness. Zoe's mother called her name down the hallway. No answer. Her bedroom door stood open, bed unslept in, phone charger still plugged into the wall where she'd left it the day before. The first tendrils of worry began their slow curl in her chest. Zoe always came home, always texted, always kept her word. By 6:45 a.m., the phone call to Lubbock police came through their non-emergency line, voice steady but strained. "I need to report my daughter missing. She's been gone all night." The missing person report carried official weight, name, description, last known clothing, vehicle information, officer notebooks filled with details. Zoe Gabrielle Campos, 18 years old, Hispanic female, last seen leaving home around 9:30 p.m. on November 17th. Gray sedan, Texas plates. No history of running away. No signs of personal crisis. The machinery of law enforcement began its methodical turn. Call logs were pulled. Social media accounts scanned. Surveillance footage requested from nearby businesses. The digital breadcrumbs of a life suddenly interrupted, all pointing toward the same conclusion. Zoe had simply vanished. But in a city of 250,000 people, disappearance rarely happens in a vacuum. Someone always sees something. Someone always knows more than they realize. The first tip came in that evening, crackling through the police radio with the electric urgency of hope. Caller reports seeing the missing girl's vehicle near Avenue Q. Gray sedan, matches the description exactly. The investigation had found its first thread. The sodium lamps threw long shadows across the intersection as Zoe's aunt pressed the accelerator, heart hammering against her ribs. There, 2 cars ahead, the familiar gray sedan that had become the most important vehicle in Lubbock. 11:10 p.m. on Monday, November 18th. Less than 24 hours since Zoe had disappeared, and now her car was moving through the city's quiet streets, driven by someone who shouldn't have the keys. The figure behind the wheel was hunched forward, hood pulled up despite the moderate evening temperature. Male, from what she could tell in the shifting light of passing street lamps. Moving with purpose, taking turns that suggested local knowledge. Someone who knew these roads. She followed at a careful distance, phone pressed to her ear as she relayed directions to the 911 dispatcher. "He's turning east on 19th Street now, still heading toward the university area. Can you get a unit over here?" But traffic lights have their own agenda. When the hooded driver ran a yellow that had already shifted to red, she had to choose between safety and pursuit. By the time she reached the intersection, his taillights had vanished into the maze of residential streets that spiderwebbed through central Lubbock. The 911 call would be logged, transcribed, and filed away with the growing collection of evidence that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Zoe's car had been taken by someone who didn't belong behind the wheel, someone who knew enough to avoid the main thoroughfares, who moved through the city like a ghost trying not to be seen. The witness statement would be typed up later that night, preserving the details that might matter weeks or months down the road: approximate height, build, clothing description. The timestamp that placed the vehicle near Avenue Q at 11:10 p.m. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of losing the trail, there was only the empty intersection and the growing certainty that Zoe was in trouble. The West Texas wind stirred the tall grass as volunteers spread across the vacant lots and canal banks that bordered Lubbock's quieter neighborhoods. Dawn had broken gray and cold, bringing with it an army of searchers who moved methodically through terrain that could hide secrets. Detective David Schreiber coordinated the effort from his position near the command tent, radio chatter providing a constant backdrop of negative results. Nothing in Sector 7 cleared the drainage ditch behind the mall. K-9 unit, requesting to move to the next grid. 3 days had passed since Zoe vanished. 3 days of expanding search patterns, interviewed witnesses, and forensic examination of her recovered vehicle. The gray sedan had been found abandoned in an apartment complex parking lot, wiped clean of prints but carrying traces of a story the crime scene techs were still trying to read. Phone records painted a partial picture. Zoe's cell had last pinged towers in the area around 70th Street, a detail that felt significant without yet revealing why. The location data suggested movement, then abrupt silence, as if the phone had been turned off or destroyed. Television news crews had arrived by Wednesday, turning the search into a public vigil that drew volunteers from across the South Plains. Churches organized prayer groups. High school classmates printed flyers with Zoe's photograph. Social media filled with shares and speculation, the kind of grassroots attention that could either help an investigation or complicate it with false leads. By midweek, Detective Schreiber's whiteboard carried dozens of tips, witness statements, and forensic requests. But the essential questions remained unchanged. Where was Zoe? Who had taken her car? And why had a promising 18-year-old, with her whole life ahead of her, simply vanished from the streets of her own hometown? The K-9 units moved through another section of grassland, their handlers watching for any sign of interest. Somewhere in this sprawling city, answers waited to be uncovered. The fluorescent lights in the LPD interview rooms hummed with the particular exhaustion that settles over long investigations. Detective Schreiber had conducted dozens of interviews in the weeks following Zoe's disappearance, each conversation adding another piece to a puzzle that refused to resolve into clear picture. Friends from high school spoke of Zoe's excitement about college plans, her part-time job, the ordinary concerns of someone transitioning into adulthood. Co-workers described a reliable employee who showed up on time and got along with everyone. Family members painted the portrait of a daughter and sister who had never given them cause for serious worry. But investigations live in the spaces between official statements, in the hesitations and contradictions that emerge when people try to remember events under pressure. Someone mentioned seeing Zoe talking to a man they didn't recognize outside a convenience store. Another witness thought they'd seen her car at a house party, but couldn't be certain of the date. The interview transcripts filled binders that grew thicker each week, containing hours of recorded conversations that might hold the key to everything or nothing at all. The challenge lay in separating genuine leads from the inevitable false memories and wishful thinking that complicated every high-profile missing person case. Prosecutor Jessica Gorman reviewed the accumulated evidence weekly, searching for anything that might support charges if a suspect emerged. But prosecutors needed more than suspicion and circumstance. They needed proof that would convince 12 jurors beyond reasonable doubt. As autumn faded toward winter, the search patterns began to contract. Resources were finite, and other cases demanded attention. The volunteers drifted back to their regular lives, carrying with them the weight of good intentions that hadn't been enough. Zoe's family maintained their own vigil, refusing to let hope die even as the official investigation entered its quieter phase. They knew what the police couldn't say directly, that missing person cases had windows of opportunity, and those windows were closing fast. 1 year later, the drizzle fell steady and cold on the memorial gathering in City Park. Purple ribbons fluttered from tree branches like prayers made visible, while dozens of candles created a circle of light against the November darkness. Zoe's photograph smiled from poster boards propped against the park pavilion, her face becoming the symbol of every family's worst fear and every community's promise to remember. The anniversary had drawn local media attention back to a case that had faded from daily headlines, but never left the collective consciousness of a city that had refused to forget. Detective Schreiber stood at the edge of the crowd, his presence a reminder that the official investigation continued even when public attention wavered. The case files remained active in his desk drawer, reviewed monthly for any new angle that might break open the mystery that had consumed thousands of hours of police work. The tip line still rang occasionally. Every few weeks, someone would call with a possible sighting, a half-remembered conversation, a nagging feeling that something they'd seen might be important. Each call was logged, investigated, and ultimately filed away when the lead failed to produce evidence. But cold cases had their own rhythm, their own patient timeline. Evidence that meant nothing in the immediate aftermath of a crime sometimes gained significance years later, when viewed through the lens of accumulated knowledge. Witnesses remembered details they'd forgotten. Technology advanced. Databases grew more sophisticated. The vigil organizers passed out flyers with the police tip line number, understanding that justice might come from the most unexpected directions. Someone in the crowd might know something without realizing its importance. Someone might finally find the courage to speak after months or years of guilty silence. As the candles burned down to pools of wax in the cold rain, Lubbock renewed its promise to Zoe and her family. The case would not be forgotten. The search would continue. Somewhere in the city's streets and structures, truth waited to be discovered. 4 years had transformed the case from active investigation to cold file, but Detective David Schreiber still pulled the folders from his desk drawer every few months, spreading photographs and timeline charts across his workspace like a poker player studying cards that never quite formed a winning hand. The LPD cold case office occupied a corner of the building where afternoon sunlight slanted through windows overlooking the parking lot. Map pins marked locations where Zoe's phone had last connected to cell towers, creating a geographic fingerprint that pointed toward the neighborhoods around 70th Street, without revealing specifics. New technology had brought fresh possibilities to old evidence. DNA databases continued to expand. Surveillance systems had multiplied throughout the city. Social media platforms maintained archived data that investigators could request through proper legal channels. But the essential challenge remained unchanged. Without a body, a witness, or a confession, the prosecutor's office lacked the foundation necessary to file charges against anyone. Suspicion wasn't evidence. Theories weren't proof. The legal system demanded certainty that the investigation had never been able to provide. Schreiber had reviewed every interview, transcript, every witness statement, every piece of physical evidence collected during the initial search. The case had been worked thoroughly, professionally, by detectives who understood the stakes. No stone had been left unturned, no lead left unexplored. Yet something had been missed. Something always was in cases that remained unsolved. The missing piece might be microscopic, a fiber, a fingerprint, a phone call, or it might be obvious, hiding in plain sight among thousands of pages of documentation. Outside his office window, construction crews had begun work on a residential project in the 1900 block of 70th Street. The coincidence of location wasn't lost on Schreiber, who had studied those coordinates countless times on his case maps, but coincidence was all it seemed to be, at least for now. November 16, 2018, arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made construction work tolerable in West Texas. The crew breaking ground behind the house in the 1900 block of 70th Street had expected a routine job: foundation, work, utility lines, the mundane infrastructure of suburban development. The excavator's bucket bit into soil that had been undisturbed for years, revealing layers of earth that told the quiet story of a neighborhood's growth. 3 feet down, the machine's operator noticed something that didn't belong: irregular shapes in the dirt that looked too purposeful to be natural. By evening, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind while forensic technicians worked under portable lights, their careful excavation revealing what 5 years of searching had failed to uncover. Human remains, shallow buried, wrapped in fabric that had deteriorated but not disappeared entirely. The positioning and depth suggested hasty concealment rather than formal burial. Someone had dug quickly, carelessly, driven by necessity rather than respect. LPD crime scene unit worked through the night, photographing and cataloging every detail before the remains were carefully extracted and transported to the medical examiner's office. Soil samples were collected from multiple locations. Fiber evidence was preserved. The entire area was documented with the methodical precision that would be required if the case ever reached trial. Detective Schreiber arrived before dawn, studying the excavation site with the focused intensity of someone who had waited 5 years for this moment. The location aligned with the cell phone data from November 2013. The timeline fit. The circumstances suggested exactly the kind of concealment that a panicked killer might attempt. but identification would require laboratory confirmation, DNA comparison, official verification. The families of missing persons throughout the region would wait anxiously for results that might finally provide answers to questions that had haunted them for years. By morning, news crews had gathered outside the police tape, broadcasting live updates to a community that had never forgotten Zoe Gabrielle Campos. The Lubbock County Forensic Laboratory operated with the quiet efficiency of a place where truth emerged through chemistry and careful analysis. DNA extraction from skeletal remains required patience, precision, and techniques that had advanced significantly since 2013. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the chief medical examiner, had handled hundreds of cases during her career, but she understood the weight of this particular analysis. A family had waited 5 years for answers. A community had organized searches and vigils. A detective had carried the file through multiple assignments and promotions. The remains told their story in the language of forensic science. Osteological examination confirmed female, approximately 18 years of age, height and build consistent with Zoe Campos. Dental records would provide additional confirmation, but the DNA comparison would be definitive. When the laboratory results came back positive, Detective Schreiber made the call that would finally close one chapter of the investigation while opening another. The remains were Zoe. The manner of death was homicide by manual strangulation. The location of burial was the backyard of a residence that property records connected to Carlos Andrew Rodriquez. The news spread through Lubbock with the electric speed of social media and local television. Prayer groups that had maintained hope for 5 years grieved for confirmation of their worst fears. Search volunteers who had combed fields and drainage ditches felt the complex mixture of relief and sorrow that comes with terrible answers to necessary questions. But identification was only the beginning. Now the investigation could focus on the who and why that had remained elusive when the case was merely a missing person report. Evidence that had been collected and preserved could be re-examined in light of what was now known to be a murder. The property on 70th Street, which had seemed like nothing more than a coincidental proximity to cell phone data, suddenly became the center of a homicide investigation that would demand every forensic technique available to modern law enforcement. Police Chief Greg Stevens scheduled a press conference for that afternoon, understanding that the community deserved official confirmation of what many had suspected but no one had wanted to believe. The house in the 1900 block of 70th Street stood quiet in the morning light, as the forensic team prepared for what would be the most detailed examination of a potential crime scene in recent Lubbock history. Search warrants had been executed with the precision that came from years of preparation and the certainty that comes from finding a body. Luminol testing revealed what the naked eye couldn't see: traces of blood that had soaked into floorboards and been painted over, cleaned repeatedly, but never completely erased. The chemical reaction created an eerie blue glow in the darkened rooms, mapping patterns that suggested violence and the desperate attempts to conceal it. The crime scene reconstruction painted a picture of struggle and concealment. Blood spatter analysis indicated an attack from behind, consistent with manual strangulation. The positioning suggested Zoe had been facing away from her attacker when the assault began, possibly caught off guard by someone she had trusted enough to turn her back on. Sections of flooring were cut and removed for laboratory analysis. Soil samples from the backyard were compared to trace evidence found on the remains. Paint chips and fiber evidence were cataloged with the hope that they might eventually be matched to a suspect's clothing or vehicle. The house itself became a witness, its walls and floors telling the story of a crime that someone had worked desperately to hide. Every surface was photographed, every room measured and documented. The forensic team worked with the understanding that this evidence might be their only chance to prove what had happened on the night Zoe disappeared. Detective Schreiber coordinated the scene investigation, while simultaneously preparing for what he knew would be an intensive interrogation process. Property records and witness statements from 2013 would need to be re-examined. Anyone connected to the residence during the relevant time period would be interviewed again. The case that had been cold for 5 years was suddenly burning hot, demanding immediate action and careful attention to the legal procedures that would be required to secure a conviction. The envelope arrived at the KCBD newsroom on a Tuesday morning in summer 2019, addressed in careful handwriting that conveyed none of the chaos its contents would unleash. News organizations received hundreds of letters every month, press releases, complaints, tips from conspiracy theorists, and attention seekers. But this letter was different. The reporter who opened it recognized immediately that the handwritten pages contained either the most elaborate hoax in the station's history or the confession that would finally solve Lubbock's most notorious cold case. Carlos Andrew Rodriquez had written his confession in the careful script of someone who wanted to be understood completely. The details were specific, damning, and consistent with the forensic evidence that had been recovered from the 70th Street property. He described smoking two laced cigarillos with Zoe inside the residence. He admitted to strangling her from behind when the drug made him paranoid and violent. He confessed to burying her body in the backyard and covering the grave with concrete and debris. The newsroom fell silent as the confession was read aloud, each paragraph confirming what investigators had theorized, but never been able to prove. The letter provided the missing link between the physical evidence and the person responsible for Zoe's death, but journalism demanded verification before publication. The confession was immediately turned over to law enforcement, while legal experts debated the admissibility of evidence that had been sent to media rather than police. Defense attorneys would certainly challenge any confession obtained outside official channels. Detective Schreiber read the letter with the careful attention of someone who had spent 6 years searching for exactly this information. Every detail aligned with the evidence. Every admission corresponded to facts that only the killer could have known. The case that had seemed impossibly complex suddenly became straightforward. Carlos Andrew Rodriquez had confessed to murder, provided details that matched the crime scene, and created a legal pathway to prosecution. Now the question was whether a jury would accept the confession of someone who had waited years to admit his guilt. The LPD interview room smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee as Detective Schreiber set up the recording equipment for what would be the most important interrogation of his career. Carlos Andrew Rodriquez sat across the metal table, smaller in person than his confession had made him seem, ordinary in the way that made his crimes more disturbing rather than less. The formal interview began with constitutional warnings, legal procedures, and the careful establishment of a record that would be admissible in court. Rodriquez waived his right to an attorney, claiming he wanted to get this over with after years of carrying the secret. His confession was methodical, almost clinical in its detail. He described November 17, 2013, as a night when synthetic marijuana had made him paranoid and aggressive. Zoe had come to the house willingly, planning to smoke with him before heading home to her family. The K2 had affected his judgment, he claimed, making him suspicious of her motives, and violent in his response. The strangulation had happened quickly, he said. From behind, while she was facing away, she had struggled briefly before losing consciousness, and he had continued applying pressure until he was certain she was dead. The burial had been hasty, panicked, accomplished with a shovel borrowed from a neighbor, and concrete blocks meant to prevent discovery. Detective Schreiber asked carefully crafted questions designed to elicit details that only the killer could know, information that had never been released to the public or media. Rodriquez provided those details without hesitation, describing the exact location of the grave, the positioning of the body, the materials used to conceal evidence. The recorded confession would later be transcribed, analyzed by legal experts, and ultimately become the foundation of the prosecution's case. But sitting in that interview room, listening to a man calmly describe the murder of an 18-year-old girl, Schreiber felt the weight of justice finally beginning to balance after years of hanging in suspension. The case that had defined his career was finally moving toward resolution. August 7, 2022, dawned clear and hot in Lubbock, the kind of summer morning that promised another scorching day in West Texas. But inside the air-conditioned confines of the 140th District Court, the temperature was controlled, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. District Judge Douglas Freitag had scheduled the pretrial hearing to resolve the single most important question facing the prosecution. Would Carlos Andrew Rodriquez's confession be admissible at trial? Defense attorney Jeff Nicholson had filed motions challenging every aspect of the letter's authenticity, chain of custody, and legal validity. The gallery was packed with reporters, family members, and curious citizens who had followed the case through 6 years of investigation. Zoe's mother sat in the front row, her face composed but her hands twisted together in her lap. Detective Schreiber occupied a seat near the prosecution table, case files arranged in careful stacks. Prosecutor Jessica Gorman argued that the confession had been voluntarily provided to media, properly preserved by journalists, and legally obtained by law enforcement through standard investigative procedures. The handwriting had been verified by expert analysis. The details corresponded exactly to physical evidence that had never been publicly disclosed. Nicholson countered that confessions obtained outside official channels violated his client's constitutional rights, that media involvement had contaminated the evidence, and that the letter might have been coerced by psychological pressure rather than genuine remorse. Judge Freitag listened to both arguments with the careful attention of someone who understood that his ruling would determine whether the case proceeded to trial or collapsed entirely. The legal precedents were clear, but the circumstances were unusual. Few murderers confessed by mailing letters to television stations. When court recessed for lunch, The hallways buzzed with speculation and nervous energy. Justice for Zoe had waited 9 years. The community had organized searches, held vigils, and refused to let her memory fade. Now everything depended on a single legal decision. Judge Freitag returned that afternoon with a ruling that would change everything. The confession was admissible. The case would proceed to trial. The district attorney's office resembled a war room in the weeks following Judge Freitag's ruling. Evidence boards covered every available wall space. Timeline charts traced the events of November 2013, and bankers' boxes full of documents occupied every chair and table. Prosecutor Jessica Gorman had built her career on cases that demanded meticulous preparation and flawless presentation. The Rodriquez trial would be the most closely watched prosecution in recent Lubbock history, and she understood that the community's faith in the justice system would be measured by the outcome. The evidence was strong but complex. The confession provided motive and method, but the defense would challenge every detail. The forensic evidence was compelling but technical, requiring expert witnesses who could explain DNA analysis and crime scene reconstruction to jurors without legal or scientific training. Witness preparation consumed endless hours. Detective Schreiber reviewed his investigative timeline repeatedly, anticipating cross-examination questions about the 5-year gap between Zoe's disappearance and the discovery of her remains. The medical examiner practiced explaining cause of death in language accessible to laypeople. Victim impact statements would be powerful but emotional, requiring careful balance between honoring Zoe's memory and maintaining the professional detachment necessary for legal proceedings. The prosecution team worked with family members to prepare testimony that would be both heartfelt and legally appropriate. Media attention intensified as the trial date approached. True crime podcasters requested interviews. National news networks expressed interest in covering the proceedings. The courthouse prepared for the kind of public scrutiny that accompanied cases involving young victims and long-delayed justice. But beneath the media circus and legal maneuvering, the case remained what it had always been, the story of a promising young woman whose life had been stolen by someone she had trusted enough to be alone with. The trial would determine whether that person would be held accountable for his choices. Justice had waited 9 years. It could wait a few more weeks for proper preparation. August 15, 2022, arrived with the humid heat of a South Plains summer and the electric anticipation of a community that had waited 9 years for justice. The 140th District Court was packed to capacity, with overflow crowds gathering on the courthouse steps and television crews broadcasting live from the parking lot. Jury selection had been completed the previous week. 12 citizens chosen for their ability to consider evidence objectively, despite years of local media coverage. The panel included teachers, retirees, small business owners, and factory workers, a cross-section of Lubbock County residents who would decide Carlos Andrew Rodriquez's fate. But before opening statements could begin, defense attorney Jeff Nicholson requested a sidebar conference with Judge Freitag. The whispered conversation lasted several minutes while the courtroom held its collective breath, sensing that something significant was about to change. When Nicholson returned to the defense table, he spoke quietly to his client for several moments. Rodriquez nodded slowly, then stood when Judge Freitag called the court to order. "Your Honor," Nicholson announced, "my client wishes to change his plea to guilty for the offense of murder." The words hung in the courtroom air like thunder after lightning, followed by an immediate eruption of gasps, sobs, and whispered conversations. Judge Freitag gavelled for order, while court reporters typed furiously, and camera operators adjusted their angles to capture the historic moment. The guilty plea transformed the trial from a question of guilt or innocence to a punishment proceeding. The jury would still hear evidence, but their task would be determining whether Rodriquez deserved life in prison or a lesser sentence that might eventually allow parole. For Zoe's family, the plea represented both vindication and frustration. Their daughter's killer had finally admitted his guilt, but they had been denied the complete airing of evidence that a full trial would have provided. Justice was coming, but in a form they hadn't expected. The case that had consumed nearly a decade of their lives was suddenly racing toward conclusion. The punishment phase of the trial allowed prosecutor Jessica Gorman to present the full scope of evidence against Carlos Andrew Rodriquez, painting a complete picture of the crime that had shocked Lubbock and devastated a family. The confession letter was read aloud in its entirety. Rodriquez's own words, describing how he had lured Zoe to the 70th Street house, provided her with K2-laced cigarillos, and then strangled her from behind during a drug-induced paranoid episode. The clinical language of the confession contrasted sharply with the emotional impact of the crime it described. Forensic evidence supported every detail of the written admission. Crime scene photographs showed the luminol reactions that had revealed blood traces in the house's flooring. Soil analysis confirmed that the backyard grave had been dug hastily and covered with concrete blocks in an attempt to prevent discovery. The medical examiner testified about cause of death, using anatomical models to explain how manual strangulation had crushed Zoe's windpipe and cut off oxygen to her brain. The violence had been intimate and personal, requiring close physical contact and sustained pressure that indicated deliberate intent to kill. Detective Schreiber walked the jury through 9 years of investigation, from the initial missing person report through the careful excavation of remains and the painstaking forensic analysis that had connected evidence to suspect. His testimony emphasized the professional dedication that had kept the case active even during the coldest periods. Gorman argued that the evidence revealed a pattern of manipulation and violence that demanded the maximum punishment available under Texas law. Rodriquez had not simply made a mistake or lost control temporarily. He had planned concealment, executed cover-up, and maintained deception for years while Zoe's family suffered without answers. The prosecution rested with a simple request: life in prison for a life taken too soon. Defense attorney Jeff Nicholson faced an impossible task: convincing 12 jurors to show mercy to someone who had confessed to murdering an 18-year-old girl and hiding her body for 5 years. His strategy focused on acceptance of responsibility and the mitigating factors that might distinguish his client from the most heinous killers. Rodriquez had ultimately confessed voluntarily, Nicholson argued, demonstrating remorse that suggested he was not irredeemably evil. The defense presentation included testimony about Rodriquez's troubled background, substance abuse problems, and mental health issues that may have contributed to his violent behavior. Expert witnesses described the effects of synthetic marijuana on judgment and impulse control, suggesting that the murder had been an aberrant act during a period of severe intoxication. Character witnesses testified that Rodriquez had shown capacity for normal relationships and productive work when not under the influence of drugs. His family members spoke of their shock and disappointment, describing someone they had never imagined capable of such violence. But Nicholson's most difficult moment came during cross-examination of Detective Schreiber, when he attempted to suggest that the investigation had been conducted with less than perfect efficiency. The exchange grew heated, as Schreiber defended the thoroughness of the search efforts and the challenge of solving a crime with no witnesses and limited physical evidence. The detective's response was sharp and professional. "We worked this case every day for 9 years. We never stopped looking for Zoe, and when the evidence finally led us to your client, he confessed because he knew we had found the truth." Nicholson concluded his case by asking jurors to consider that justice could be served without the ultimate punishment of life imprisonment. His client had already lost his freedom, his reputation, and his future. A sentence less than life would still ensure decades in prison, while acknowledging his eventual cooperation with authorities. The defense rested with a plea for mercy in a case where mercy seemed impossible to find. The victim impact statements began at 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday that had already stretched the emotional limits of everyone present in Judge Freitag's courtroom. Zoe's mother approached the witness stand with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent 9 years preparing for this moment without knowing when or if it would ever come. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she described the daughter she had raised with hope and love, the girl who had texted, "Be home soon," and never returned. She spoke of birthday celebrations that had become memorial services, Christmas mornings that felt empty despite the presence of other family members, and the particular agony of not knowing what had happened during the years when Zoe was simply missing. "You stole more than her life," she said, looking directly at Rodriquez for the first time during the proceedings. "You stole our ability to grieve properly. You stole our peace. You stole 9 years of not knowing whether to hope or mourn." Zoe's sister followed with her own statement, describing how the murder had changed her worldview and altered her relationship with trust, safety, and faith in human nature. She had been forced to grow up in a world where her sister's killer walked free, where family gatherings were haunted by absence, where every news report about missing persons brought back the trauma of their own experience. The statements continued for over an hour, each family member adding their voice to a chorus of grief that filled the courtroom with the human cost of violence. They spoke of sleepless nights, of therapy sessions, of the way trauma had rippled through their extended family and friend networks like stones thrown into still water. But they also spoke of Zoe's memory, of the scholarship fund established in her name, of the advocacy work they had undertaken to support other families facing similar tragedies. Their daughter and sister had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for community action. The final statement came from Zoe's grandmother, whose voice cracked as she described watching her granddaughter grow from a curious child into a young woman with dreams and ambitions that would never be fulfilled. She wanted to be a teacher, the elderly woman said. She wanted to help other children learn and grow. Instead, she became a lesson about evil that no family should have to learn. When the victim impact statements concluded, the courtroom fell into the kind of silence that follows profound sorrow. Judge Freitag called a brief recess before closing arguments, understanding that both jurors and spectators needed time to process the emotional weight of what they had heard. Justice was no longer an abstract legal concept. It had faces, voices, and broken hearts that demanded acknowledgement. The closing arguments began at 4 p.m., with prosecutor Jessica Gorman standing before a jury that had spent 3 days immersed in the details of premeditated murder and calculated concealment. Her final appeal was methodical and powerful, weaving together confession, forensic evidence, and victim impact into a narrative that demanded the maximum punishment available under Texas law. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you have heard the defendant's own words describing how he lured Zoe Campos to his house, drugged her with synthetic marijuana, and then strangled her to death when the drugs made him paranoid and violent. You have seen the evidence that he buried her body in his backyard and covered the grave with concrete blocks to hide his crime." Gorman walked the jury through the confession letter one final time, emphasizing the deliberate nature of each action described. The murder had not been a moment of passion or temporary insanity. It had been followed by careful planning to conceal evidence and avoid detection. The defendant kept this secret for 5 years while Zoe's family organized search parties, held vigils, and prayed for answers that only he could provide. He watched their suffering and chose silence. He chose to let them live with uncertainty while he knew exactly where their daughter lay buried. The prosecutor's voice grew stronger as she approached her conclusion. "This case is about accountability. It is about justice delayed but not denied. It is about ensuring that someone who took a young woman's life and hid her body for half a decade pays the full price for his choices." Defense attorney Jeff Nicholson followed with a plea for mercy that acknowledged his client's guilt while arguing for a sentence less than life imprisonment. He emphasized the confession as evidence of remorse, the substance abuse as a mitigating factor, and the possibility of rehabilitation over decades of incarceration. But his words carried little weight against the mountain of evidence and emotion that had accumulated over 3 days of testimony. When he sat down, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, understanding that the final decision now rested with 12 citizens who had heard more than enough to reach a verdict. Judge Freitag provided jury instructions about Texas sentencing law, explaining that a life sentence would require Rodriquez to serve 30 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. The jurors filed out to begin deliberations with the weight of an entire community's expectations on their shoulders. The jury deliberation room was smaller than most people expected, with a rectangular table surrounded by 12 chairs and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in stark relief. The foreperson, a retired teacher who had raised 3 children in Lubbock, called for an initial discussion of the evidence before any formal voting, but the conversation was brief and unanimous. The confession had been detailed and credible. The forensic evidence had supported every claim. The victim impact statements had illustrated the profound harm caused by years of concealment and deception. 14 minutes after entering the deliberation room, the jury reached their verdict. The foreperson signed the form with a steady hand, understanding that the decision would bring closure to a case that had haunted their community for nearly a decade. The bailiff's knock on the door summoned them back to the courtroom, where news of their quick deliberation had already spread through social media and local news networks. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in the hallway and on the courthouse steps. Judge Freitag called the court to order as the jurors filed back to their seats. The foreperson stood when asked if they had reached a verdict, holding the signed form that contained the answer an entire city had waited to hear. "We have, Your Honor. We sentence the defendant to life in prison." The words triggered an immediate eruption of emotion throughout the courtroom. Zoe's family embraced through tears of relief and vindication. Supporters applauded despite judicial warnings about courtroom decorum. Even seasoned reporters wiped their eyes as they typed updates on phones and laptops. Carlos Andrew Rodriquez showed no visible reaction as bailiffs prepared to escort him back to jail. His confession had brought the case to this moment, but his expression suggested neither remorse nor acceptance. He had simply been caught, tried, and convicted for choices made on a November night 9 years earlier. Judge Freitag thanked the jury for their service and formally sentenced Rodriquez to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Under Texas law, He would be 78 years old before becoming eligible for release consideration. The gavel fell one final time, officially closing a case that had defined Detective Schreiber's career, tested a family's faith, and challenged a community's capacity for patience and justice. The courthouse steps filled with an impromptu celebration as news of the life sentence spread through Lubbock via social media, text messages, and local news alerts. 9 years of waiting had finally culminated in accountability for the person who had stolen Zoe Campos's life and hidden her body while her family suffered without answers. Detective Schreiber stood near the courthouse entrance, accepting congratulations from colleagues and community members who had supported the investigation through its longest and most difficult periods. The case had consumed nearly a decade of his career, but seeing the relief on the faces of Zoe's family made every late night and dead end worthwhile. Zoe's mother addressed the gathered media with a statement that balanced gratitude for justice with acknowledgement that no legal outcome could restore what had been lost. "This verdict cannot bring Zoe back to us," she said, "but it ensures that the person responsible for her death will pay the price for his choices. Our daughter can finally rest in peace." The family's attorney announced that they would use the media attention to advocate for other families dealing with missing persons cases, understanding that their experience had given them unique insight into the challenges faced by law enforcement and the emotional toll carried by survivors. Local news crews interviewed jurors who were willing to speak about their deliberation process. The foreperson explained that the confession had made their decision straightforward, but the victim impact statements had reinforced their understanding of the broader harm caused by years of concealment. 14 minutes was long enough to review the evidence, she told reporters. The defendant's own words told us everything we needed to know about his guilt and the punishment he deserved. Community leaders praised the persistence of law enforcement and the patience of citizens who had never stopped, believing that justice would eventually prevail. The case would be studied by police academies and legal schools as an example of how cold cases could be solved through methodical investigation and advances in forensic technology. But for Zoe's family, the courthouse steps represented not celebration, but closure, the end of a chapter defined by uncertainty and the beginning of a new phase focused on healing and remembrance. 6 months after the trial, Detective David Schreiber sat in the LPD briefing room, surrounded by case files from other unsolved homicides and missing persons investigations. The techniques that had finally cracked the Campos case, evidence preservation, media engagement, forensic advances, were being applied to cold files that had gathered dust for years. The successful prosecution had brought renewed attention to the importance of maintaining active cold case investigations, even when public interest waned. Department leadership had approved additional resources for the unit, understanding that families deserved persistence and communities deserved closure. A fresh tip had come in the previous week regarding a missing person case from 2009, inspired by the media coverage surrounding Rodriquez's conviction. Someone had finally found the courage to share information they had kept secret for over a decade, demonstrating how solving one case could generate leads in others. The community response had been overwhelming. Donors had established a fund to support advanced DNA testing for unsolved cases. Volunteer search organizations had been reinvigorated by proof that their efforts could eventually yield results. The Campos family had become advocates for other families navigating similar tragedies. True crime podcasts and television documentaries had featured Zoe's case as an example of investigative persistence and the power of forensic science to unlock secrets that time had tried to bury. But the media attention had been respectful, focusing on the investigative process rather than sensationalizing the violence. Schreiber kept Zoe's photograph on his desk as a reminder that every case file represented a real person whose life had been cut short by violence. The successful prosecution had validated years of patient work, but it had also reinforced his commitment to the families still waiting for answers. Justice had been delayed but not denied in Zoe's case. Other families deserved the same dedication, the same refusal to accept that some questions would never be answered. The phone rang with another tip, another possibility, another family's hope that their loved one had not been forgotten. As the sun set over Lubbock on the anniversary of Zoe's murder, families and friends gathered once again in the city park, where vigils had been held during the years when her fate remained unknown. But this year's memorial carried a different energy, not the desperate hope of the unsolved case, but the quiet peace that comes with justice served and truth revealed. Purple ribbons still fluttered from tree branches, now joined by photographs chronicling Zoe's life from childhood through her final year. The scholarship fund established in her name had grown to support 3 local students pursuing education degrees, ensuring that her dream of becoming a teacher would live on through others. Detective Schreiber attended the memorial as he had every year since taking over the case, but this time he brought with him the case file marked "Solved" in red ink. A local artist had created a memorial plaque that would be permanently installed in the park, bearing Zoe's name and dates along with a simple inscription, "Remembered with love, honored with justice." The crowd included many faces familiar from the courthouse jurors who had delivered the life sentence, attorneys who had argued the case, journalists who had covered the investigation, but it also included new faces, families dealing with their own missing persons cases, who had found hope in Zoe's story. Zoe's mother lit the central candle as she had for 9 years, but this time her words carried finality rather than pleading. "Zoe's story is complete now," she said to the gathered crowd. "Her killer has been held accountable. Her memory has been honored. Her legacy will continue through the lives she touches and the students who benefit from her scholarship." The memorial concluded with a moment of silence that felt different from all the others. Not the silence of unanswered questions, but the silence of a community that had kept faith through the darkest period and emerged with its belief in justice intact. One candle burned longer than the others, its flame steady in the evening breeze before finally dimming to a golden glow that seemed to carry all the love, loss, and hope of a story that had tested a community's soul and ultimately reaffirmed its strength. Time had tried to bury the truth, but truth had proven stronger than time. Some promises echo across the years until they find their fulfillment. Some lights refuse to be extinguished. Some voices demand to be heard, no matter how long the silence lasts. Zoe Gabrielle Campos was finally home.